Hello, my name is Jennifer Makalarski. Welcome to Providing Constructive Critiques for the Advanced Elective courses. This lecture will cover techniques for providing constructive critiques. Both in your coursework as well as in your professional career, you are likely to be asked to review the work of your peers. When doing so, you want to do your best to maximize the usefulness of your review. And, in my experience, how you deliver your feedback on another's work is as important, if not more important, than the feedback itself. We will discuss an overall strategy for critiquing your peers' work and techniques for maximizing the usefulness of your critiques. First, let's talk about what the word critique means. The Oxford Dictionary defines the noun critique as a detailed analysis and assessment of something. There are two things I especially want you to notice about this definition. First, the word detailed. Providing constructive critiques goes beyond a simple good job or I think this is well done. Critiquing the work of others requires an attention to detail. Secondly, unlike the word criticism, by definition, critique does not imply an inherent problem or that something is wrong with the work. In other words, critiquing the work of someone else isn't just about pointing out what is wrong. In fact, sometimes we critique work that really doesn't have much of anything wrong at all. But just because it's not wrong does not mean it can't be better. Now, what about constructive? The Oxford Dictionary defines the adjective constructive as having or intended to have a useful or beneficial purpose. In other words, when I say we want to provide constructive critiques, it means we want to provide a detailed assessment or analysis of our peer's work in a way that is useful to our peer. We don't want to comment or nitpick. We want to provide comments that are useful for improving our peer's work. So why are we talking about this, these words that most of you are probably familiar with? And why would we ask our peers for constructive critiques? The reason is simple, and sometimes I think it's so simple we miss it. We want constructive critiques from others because we are just too close to our own work. We are so close to our own work that we don't catch the obvious errors or missing pieces. We don't realize what we have forgotten or that something we have written no longer makes sense. We know our work so well, it all seems to make sense. Within reason, of course, the more eyes on our work, or the more perspectives we can glean to improve our work, the more likely our work is to reach our target audience. At this point in the program in your career, you have all likely had opportunities to critique a peer's work. You might have your own way of approaching this task. However, I encourage you to consider the general approach shown here, as well as the more specific techniques we will talk about next week. It is important to set aside sufficient time to critique others' work to be able to follow this approach. Your first step should be to read the document in its entirety. The purpose of doing this is ultimately to save you and your peer the hassle of making unnecessary comments. For example, you might believe that a piece of work is missing, but it's actually just later in the document than expected. Your comment is different then. You aren't telling your peer to write that section, but you're telling them where to move it. Reading through a document can also provide context that you need to critique the beginning of the document. In other words, you will better understand what you're leading up to and be able to effectively help with that build-up. Once you have read through the document, you can begin actually inserting your comments and text revisions. This, of course, will take the most time. Lastly, once complete, you should always reread the document, including any comments you made. Your review will be less useful if your comments or revisions also include errors or don't make sense. Now let's talk about a few techniques, some more technical than others, that can ensure your critiques are useful. First of all, use the word processing tools for reviewing documents. These are typically comment bubbles and tracked changes. These tools are designed to make your feedback easy to find. Don't write comments into the text, but comments go in comment bubbles and suggest revisions within the actual text using track changes. Oftentimes you will be reviewing the text documents in Microsoft Word. If you aren't familiar with the tools you can use in Microsoft Word to track changes and make comments, take a few minutes to review the Microsoft Office tutorial for those tools. You can find this by Googling Microsoft Word Tracking Changes. Next, be specific. When you comment, explain what could be improved and why you think it could be improved. Whenever possible, you should also be making suggestions regarding how it can be improved. Here's an example of what I mean by being specific about the what, why, and how. This is a long sentence that the two reviewers found difficult to understand. The first reviewer's feedback tells us only that they are confused. It doesn't tell us about what or why or how to resolve the confusion. This review is not especially useful. In contrast, the second reviewer tells us what is confusing, the sentence, why it's confusing, because it's too long, and makes a specific suggestion regarding how it could be improved. This is incredibly useful to the author of the work. Lastly, note that your critiques can be objective and subjective. Objective critiques are those that relate to typos or factual errors. In contrast, subjective critiques are more informed by our opinions and experience. Sometimes we think we should keep our opinions out of our review, but they are equally important to providing constructive critiques. These are the critiques that help improve the understandability and reach of a peer's work, and are often the things your peer might not have thought of. Lastly, I want to take a moment to talk about what you do when you receive critiques. I think it's obvious that you should make sure to read through all critiques. Incorporating critiques can be a challenge, however. The challenge comes in choosing what to incorporate. You will not necessarily incorporate every critique, especially if you get critiques from more than one person and they differ. It is okay to decide not to incorporate everything, but you should have fairly clear justification for doing so. Ultimately, it is still your work and should reflect the work you did. Ultimately, it is still your work and should reflect the work you did and your style of writing. That concludes this advanced elective lecture on providing constructive critiques to your peers. I hope this was helpful and will allow you to provide your peers with better feedback as you move forward in this program and your career. If you have any questions, please reach out to your instructor. Thank you.